Welcome, everybody. We're going to wait just a couple of moments here as people enter the Zoom room. We'll give it about another half a minute before we get started. All right, I think we'll go ahead and get going. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's edition of Conversations on Ocean Carbon, a U.S. West Coast and Alaska Perspective. This is a webinar series that's aiming to deliver the best available information on carbon dioxide removal, mCDR, and to explore concepts related to coastal ocean carbon. We're working together to create a dialogue among industry members, tribes, natural resource managers, and scientists throughout the West Coast and Alaska to provide a better understanding of marine carbon dioxide removal technologies, state of the science, and ways to become engaged in this field. And we want to thank all of you who have joined us for previous webinars. Those recordings can be found on YouTube. My name is Darcy Dugan. I'm with the Alaska Ocean Observing System and the director of the Alaska Ocean Acidification Network. And our network is one of 6 ocean acidification networks around the US, bringing together scientists, natural resource managers, industry, tribes, and coastal communities to try to expand the understanding of ocean acidification and also explore adaptation and mitigation options. The webinar today is co-hosted by the Alaska Ocean Acidification Network, the California Current Acidification Network, and the California Ocean Science Trust. And today I'm joined by my co-host, Lauren Linsmeyer with the California Ocean Science Trust, who will be moderating Q&A during the later portion of today's webinar, and also Alex Harper with the California Current Ocean Acidification Network and the Central and Northern California Ocean Observing System. We want to thank Emma Stone with the California Ocean Science Trust, who's working behind the scenes to make sure that our webinar is running smoothly today. And we also want to thank Alexandra Puritz with NOAA's Ocean Acidification Program, and Kevin Travis with the Ocean Science Trust for supporting this series as well. Today's title is Can Kelp Help? Exploring Macroalgae Cultivation as a Potential mCDR and Climate Mitigation Strategy. And we have 3 speakers, David Siegel from UC Santa Barbara, Kristen Davis from UC Irvine, and Rod Fujita from the Environmental Defense Fund. And we have about 90 minutes for today's webinar. The presentations are going to be about 15 to 20 minutes each, and then we'll do a moderated Q&A at the end. All the attendees are in listen-only mode right now, and you can type questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and we can pose those to the speakers, and we'll do questions after all of the presentations. We're also going to do a couple of poll questions throughout so that we can better understand this audience that we have here today and also gather some information that can help us guide future webinars. We also want to mention we're recording this session and we'll be sharing it on YouTube like the other sessions. So to kick things off, we'll do a set of 3 poll questions. The first one is to get a sense of the audience's relationship with mCDR. So we'll activate poll question number 1. What is your relationship with mCDR? We'll give everybody a minute to fill that out. And Lauren, when you feel like we've got a good number of responses, we can move to the results. Great. Okay. It looks like most people on the call are not currently involved in an mCDR project, but are interested in tracking the issue. But we also have a fair number of people who are involved in currently in an mCDR project. Great. Let's go to the second poll question is, what is your relationship with macroalgae? All right, Lauren, when you think we've had a critical mass of respondents. We can look at those results. Okay, great. So it looks like the majority, almost half of our audience, doesn't have a direct connection with macroalgae, but is interested in tracking this issue and how it fits into marine carbon dioxide removal. But we do also have some folks that are involved, it looks like. So nice spread. And then our last full question for this point in the webinar is what region you feel like you represent. Great. Okay, nice spread from most regions here, it looks like, with the majority from California. Excellent. Thank you for filling out those polls. That's helpful for us. Now I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Dr. David Siegel is a professor of marine science at UC Santa Barbara, where he's been since 1990. His research spans a wide range of issues from global carbon cycling and ocean color remote sensing to kelp forest ecology and spatial fisheries management. He served on the National Academy's 2021 study, A Research Strategy for Ocean Carbon Dioxide Removal and Sequestration. And Dave, I'm going to pass it to you here for your presentation. Looks
How are you
great.
doing? Look good? Thanks. Okay.
Great.
I just got to make all this stuff go away. So I'm going to talk about the efficacy and environmental impacts of purposeful seaweed cultivation and purposeful carbon sequestration. So why are we here? This is on the left is the Keeling curve that David Keeling started in 1958. And showing that there's a rise in atmospheric CO2 as seen from the Mauna Loa data set. We know that this has caused we know that this human-induced anthropogenic change has increased the temperature of the atmosphere, where today it's something like a 1.3 degrees warmer than it is today. And we have a path that it looks like we're heading upwards. And so the question is that, now what can we do to keep the Earth's temperature to within a degree and a half? And there's been, hello. Okay. There's been a series of policy actions, targets, pledges, all these sorts of things to get us there. This is from the Climate Action Tracker, showing what the global temperature increases are. We're about 1.3 degrees warmer than we were in the pre-industrial time. We're getting very close to the Paris Accord goal of 1.5 degrees. And if you look at all the pledges and policies and targets and all that, even in the optimistic scenario, we're not going to get to there as things look like today. So if we think about what would have to happen, we need sort of fundamental system level changes required to reduce the global net CO2 emissions. And we have to reduce the amount of emitting technologies. There's lots of conventional abatement technologies, solar, nuclear, wind, all these sorts of things, and that's the green area in this curve. You can see here that will reduce the amount of CO2 that we're emitting. And and there's going to be some residual emitting technologies that we have to, that will remain, but all the forecasts into the next century suggest that we need to do some carbon removal technologies. We have to achieve some negative net emissions. Okay, and these numbers are something like removing 10 gigatons of CO2 out of the atmosphere per year in the years 2050, and up to 20 gigatons of CO2 per year at the end of this century. So there's been a lot of there's been many negative emission approaches proposed, both on the land, so things like direct air capture here, reforestation, afforestation, biomass energy, and carbon capture, soil carbon on the land. And then in the ocean, there's a variety of techniques, including nutrient or iron fertilization. Seaweed aquaculture is what we're talking about today, as well as abiotic approaches such as alkalinity enhancement. So all of these have differences in their efficacy, meaning will they work, their scalability, can they get up to gigaton per year amounts, their durability, how long will the perturbation that we do on land will remain sequestered from the atmosphere? What are the environmental impacts? What are the economic, institutional feasibility, the social, cultural acceptability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the thing that we need to know is that it's unlikely that any one of these will scale to this amount that we need. At least today, with today's technologies, it doesn't appear that. So it suggests that a portfolio of approaches is needed to reach these goals. And as we barely understand how to do these things, there are many unknowns that we know about, and there's likely many unknowns to figure out. And that science, and the science that would support many of these things is at its infancy. So let's talk about seaweed CDR. In its most basic state, it is growing vast amounts of seaweed. Taking that as we grow that seaweed, we incorporate carbon dioxide into that biomass, and somehow we convey that biomass to depth where it remains out of connection with the surface ocean. As you know, this vertical conveyance needs to be deep enough into the ocean where it will remain sequestered for hopefully more than 100 years. The seaweeds, as they grow, they will incorporate nutrients as well, reducing the amount of nutrients that are there for primary production of the natural system, and they will also release vast amounts of dissolved organic carbon. Seaweeds are slippery. Those polysaccharides are what makes the seaweeds slippery, and there is some of which that material might be long lived. So we take and harvest the CO2, we bring it down hopefully onto the seafloor. Some of that will get remineralized back into CO2. It will, as that happens, it will suck up oxygen. It will remineralize and use the oxygen. Some of that and release new nutrients. Some of that will work its way back up to the atmosphere. Did it again. So there's lots of there's lots of issues about what it will do to the deep sea ocean. Will deoxygenate, it will acidify, it can eutrophiate, it will change. Putting vast amounts in the seafloor will change benthic communities, and it has productions of other greenhouse gases. So the questions are, is will it work? Can it contribute to the more than 10 gigatons of CO2 we need to sequester per year if we are to meet this challenge? And the back of the envelope calculation says that we have to grow a vast amount. It's at least estimates made, just back of the envelope estimates made. It's almost 1 million square kilometers. So that you can think about that as a farm, it's 1,000 kilometers on the side. So distance between here from Santa Barbara to the Oregon border squared. So it's this huge area that would have to be farmed to hit these goals. And global modeling that was done in Kristen Davis's group shows that these estimates are about right. And it suggests to get there is that we need a kind of a global network and we need a global network of sites around the world to begin to meet these goals, and we need many advances in infrastructure. And I'll talk about that. So the estimates I've made here don't consider any important feedbacks. I mean, does seaweed CDR actually sequester atmospheric CO2 in net? Meaning, do all the work that we all the carbon expenditures that we would make by growing and sequestering that carbon, is that going to be enough? Will the carbon cycle services provided by the natural biological carbon pump be balanced? We don't know, and we don't know yet, and we don't know what the impacts are to the ecosystem. So my group has a project working with folks at UCLA and the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. We have a project funded by the Advanced Research Project Authority of agency of the Department of Energy to ask the question is to assess the efficacy and environmental impacts of seaweed CDR. And our focus is what are the fates? What happens if I grow a vast amount of it, put it on the seafloor? What will happen to it? What will happen to the ecosystem? And we have the questions we want to ask are how does farm design, biomass packaging, how do we get it down to depth? What are the sites where we farm, the sites that we sequester, control the efficacy? Will it work? What is that displaced NPP of what is that displaced net prime production and carbon export from the natural system? Will it and together will the sequester CO2 and net? We question is how durable is it? If I put it on the seafloor, if I just let it loose, how and just let the crops that we produce loose, how long will it be? Will that fixed biomass be sequestered from the atmosphere? How will it affect upper ocean ecosystems, and what is the fate on the deep sea, and where it can be best conducted? And so what we're doing to approach this is to develop a system model to assess the seaweed CDR efficacy and impacts, or at least the first order impacts. So this is a kind of a diagram of the modeling system we're building. It couples four basic model approaches. One is the MAG model that Kristen Davis and Christian and Frieder developed. This MAG model looks at kelp growth and figures out how much nutrients and light the kelp need to grow. It modifies the biomass that's there, modifies the currents. We have the regional ocean model system, a circulation model that moves water around, interacts with a biogeochemical model, and from that we can assess what the local sources of sinks of dissolved inorganic carbon of CO2 is due to the kelp farming. And so we can then evaluate that in a large-scale global model to figure out its questions about durability. So this coupled modeling system, will be informed by empirical results, and I'll give some examples of what we're trying to do. But the goal is to evaluate at-scale scenarios for siting, farm design, and conveyance, so we can understand what the efficacy and impacts are. So here's the example of we're about a year and a smidge into the project. So this is pretty early results. And what we're showing here is a channel flow. So it's flowing from water is flowing from left to right here. We're looking at the nutrient fields on the left and the phytoplankton fields. So that is the displaced amount of material that is the production that is displaced because we have a farm there, where we have a high biomass farm on the top, a low in the middle, and no farm on the bottom. And so what we're trying to do is to look at what is the effect of the farm on the input of nutrients to the phytoplankton ecosystem. We can show that the farm, the drag on the farm has non-trivial spatial structures in the productivity, and the goal is to now adapt this into a real environment. And that's what we're working on today. So here's just another example. So the farm so here's a movie where we're inputting biomass every 15 days. So that's the little blue dot in this top one here. So we're dropping biomass, letting it sink through the water. Here it's sinking kind of slowly on the top panel. Here it's sinking rather rapidly on the bottom panel. And we look at what happens downstream to the amount of organic matter that is added to this as the kelp decomposes with depth. Excuse me. I'm someday I'm going to get this right. The sinking velocities are based upon empirical data that we've been collected, and the biomass, so we're able to look at what happens here. So we're at the step now that we're now starting to put this into realistic environments so we can actually build some real scenarios. So as I said, so this is we can also look at what the influence of this of seaweed CDR is, and we're just assuming that we're going to take CO2, we're going to take biomass in the surface ocean, and we're just going to put it on the seafloor, and we're going to look to see how long it takes for that biomass to come back to the surface. So this sequestration efficiency is the change in atmospheric CO2 divided by the amount of carbon biomass that we grow. And you could see initially it starts at 0 because we haven't taken any CO2 out of the atmosphere. It rapidly increases, and these are in years, and rapidly it takes maybe a year or two, maybe 10 years for that to get up to a reasonable amount of efficiency. And by putting on the seafloor, it remains out of contact with the atmosphere for at least 100 years. Eventually, that biomass is remineralized and it comes back up to the surface, and the efficiency decreases. But you can sort of see that there's large changes between places where you would do this. The green example is from the Gulf of Alaska. The red example is from the Gulf of Maine. The modeling shown here keeps in track of the finite time gas exchange in an interacting atmosphere. And it shows, where we would get, incomplete, we don't, although we fix all that biomass, we put that carbon on the seafloor, we don't get it all coming back because the upper ocean mixes rapidly. The bottom line here is that seaweed CDR, if put on the seafloor, is highly durable for more than 100 years. If we just let it free though and let it sit up to the surface, this won't be the case. So we've also been collecting empirical data to look at biomass degradation and rates and products. We take small amounts, usually less than the 50 kilograms, in bags and milk crates on the seafloor. We come back and collect them later. So this is what it started with. This is what it looks at. So we can look at the degradation rates and use that to parameterize our modeling system. We've also been doing a bunch of stuff with dissolved organic carbon. It's a great story. I don't think I have time to go through all the details here, but seaweeds produce vast amounts they release vast amounts of dissolved organic matter. Is shown here on this plot is the ratio of the net prime production. So how much CO2 is a plant blade incorporating CO2 to make more plant material. And for young, I said I wasn't going to talk about it. Watch me talk about it. And for young blades, the amount of DOC, that's released, that slimy stuff, is in very good proportion with the amount of CO2 that is fixed. However, when the blades get old, so all these red ones down here, the rate of DOC production just goes up through the roof, and the composition of the material changes, which is really cool. And so there's a very interesting. It's a great story. It's a great science story. The bottom line, it looks like all of the DOM that we have will get decomposed either due to photolysis, getting bleached, or by microbial consumption. So just to finish up, so what we've been working on, this is the same figure I showed earlier, is that there's many things that we can use this modeling system to look at. We can look at many things that happen into the deep ocean ecosystem, but we can't look at how putting vast amounts of seaweed on the seafloor alters benthic communities. So and we can't really talk about trace gases. That's things that we're not ready to do. So know that we're only focusing on a piece of the pie, a part of the pie, right? We're focusing on the geophysical and environmental feasibility. We have to implement these things. We have to say, do we have the technology to do this? Is it economically feasible? Do we have the social, is it feasible from a social cultural point of view? Do we, our institutions in place to enable this to occur? So, and so this is my last slide. So what do we know? We know that we need vast amounts of seaweed to contribute to the net negative emission goals. Vast amounts of the ocean have to be farmed if this is to be a viable solution. The good news is that it can be durable. And the good news is that if we grow it, we kind of know how much we've produced, so we would have a very good way of measuring how much that we've sequestered. We have an emerging understanding of where is best to grow the grow seaweeds, and I'm pretty sure Kristen will talk more about that. What we need to know is, will it sequester CO2 and net? And that's still an open question in my mind. And then we have all these other questions about how do farm design, packaging, conveyance to depth, all these sorts of things could contribute to the efficacy. And how will it affect the natural carbon cycle and all the ecosystem services we have? So if you sort of think about, okay, if we answer these questions and we're satisfied, what are the things we have to do next? And if 2050 is not that far away. I mean, if we are talking about needing to sequester 10 gigatons a year, that's very clear. So we need to be thinking about if we are okay societally, okay with doing this, we need to conduct pilot studies to evaluate the efficacy and to answer many of these known unknowns about seaweed CDR. These pilot studies will help us, will also help us validate system models so that we can do the validation of this. So if people want to monetize it and that sort of thing, we would have the tools to do this. And the other two issues is we have to learn how to grow vast amounts. The scales of farms we have today are much smaller than the scales of farms that have to show up into the future. And we have this hard work of obtaining social and cultural license and assessing the economics. So with that, I'll shut up.
Dave, thank you so much for that presentation. I can see there's already some great questions coming in through the question blocks. If you have questions, please add your questions in and we'll make sure to bring those up during the question and answer session. So thank you again, Dave. And now we're going to turn to Rod. Our next speaker is Rod Fujita, who will be talking about climate mitigation using seaweed products. And Rod Fujita started his career studying how seaweeds remove nutrient pollution from aquaculture facilities while producing biomass for biofuel productions during the energy crisis of the 1970s. Since 1988, he has served as the Director of Ocean Research and Development for the Environmental Defense Fund, a global environmental group, with a focus on improving fisheries performance and removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere to combat climate change. So, Rod, we'll hand it to you.
Thanks, Darcy, and hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us here. Can you see my screen okay? All right. David just gave an excellent summary of why you would want to consider growing seaweed and sinking it in order to contribute to climate mitigation. And the sinking is important in this context because that's how you get the carbon absorbed by the seaweed out of the surface ocean, where it could decompose back into carbon dioxide and bury it in the deep water where it can hang around for hundreds of years. I want to pose another question, though, because while sinking seaweed could provide a valuable service in the form of climate mitigation, the seaweed biomass itself also has a lot of value as food, as colloids, a lot of nutraceuticals, a lot of valuable products can be made from the seaweed, and sinking it, of course, obviates all of that value. So I'm going to pose this question: can seaweed products enhance climate mitigation? But really my question is, can we have both? Can we use seaweeds to sequester some carbon from the atmosphere and provide some climate mitigation and also generate value? The short answer is I don't know, but I'm going to talk about it anyway, if I can get my slide to change here. So the summary of my talk really is, can seaweed, contribute to climate mitigation? And as David said, there's huge uncertainties around that question. The bottom line is probably, in my view, that some fraction of the carbon absorbed by seaweeds, whether they're in a natural state as a seaweed bed or in a farm, is going to be remineralized to carbon dioxide just because it's part of a marine ecosystem. And everybody likes to eat seaweed and turn it into carbon dioxide, including fish, turtles, microbes, and other organisms. So this fraction that actually is sequestered by a seaweed system is always going to be just a fraction of not all of that carbon that's absorbed is going to be sequestered. So the hypothesis here is that maybe we can capture the value inherent in the seaweed biomass and increase the climate mitigation benefits of seaweed by storing that carbon instead of sinking it, storing it into products or using the seaweed to replace carbon-intensive products, thereby sparing some greenhouse gas emissions. There's another class of products that might actually directly suppress emissions of greenhouse gases like methane. And then I'll finish with a strategy for reducing the considerable knowledge gaps that remain around this topic of seaweed products and climate mitigation, some of the technical gaps, and some of the market and economic gaps. So let me begin by asserting that seaweed farming is already profitable. People have been doing it for thousands of years, and in recent years, it's been growing at about 8% per year. There's various established markets for seaweed products running into the billions of dollars. So you don't really need a carbon market. Thereby, you don't really need to demonstrate carbon sequestration to finance seaweed farming. The carbon, if there is any, the carbon sequestration benefit would be ancillary to the main value proposition of the seaweed farm. But, making different kinds of products from the seaweed might increase the climate mitigation value and also the market value of the seaweed. And if you do this locally instead of in a centralized way, that could help these seaweed farming communities, which, many of which are highly climate vulnerable and have few economic alternatives, particularly in the tropics. They could help those seaweed farming communities capture more of the value inherent in their crop than is currently the case. So this might sound good, but it's definitely not a panacea. David alluded to this. There are pluses and minuses and lots of unknowns. So growing seaweed at any scale, poses benefits and risks. It generates jobs. It generates economic development. There's some evidence that seaweeds can pull nutrients out of the water to reduce eutrophication risk in some contexts. There's some evidence also that seaweeds grown in high densities can address ocean acidification, at least locally, but we don't know the extent of that effect yet. And there's some evidence that seaweed farms can provide biogenic habitat for fishery enhancement and biodiversity, but the jury is still out on that as well. Risks include shading of natural habitats. If you grow too much seaweed over too many valuable habitats, you could reduce light. And also, you might rob these ecosystems of nutrients that would otherwise go to fuel the natural food web and support biodiversity. So David did a great job of describing how carbon moves through seaweed beds, but just to recap quickly, when you grow seaweed or when seaweed is growing naturally, they fix carbon not from the atmosphere, but from the seawater. So they pull the CO2 or bicarbonate out of the seawater, turn it into biomass, and a lot of it gets eaten by animals, which turns it back into carbon dioxide. Some of it is turned into slime, which the bacteria love to decompose. That also turns back into CO2. So none of that carbon is sequestered. Only the fraction of the seaweed biomass that turns into fragments and escapes predation by all these grazers and falls to the bottom of the sea and gets buried is sequestered. There's also some fraction of the dissolved organic carbon that's exuded by macroalgae that seems to be recalcitrant. It resists decomposition, and so that might be another pathway for sequestration. Now, when you harvest the seaweed, that removes some of the carbon absorbed by the seaweed from that natural food web. So there's a potential for that to not be remineralized, but currently, almost all that harvest is used to make food and colloids, both of which have short lifetimes. And so they don't store the carbon for an appreciable amount of time, not long enough to really affect the global warming effects of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And I just wanted to point out here that while it's often assumed that carbon absorption by the seaweed will result in drawdown of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, it's not even clear that that's the case under all conditions, because this mechanism of drawdown really depends, and therefore the climate mitigation benefit of growing seaweed with respect to carbon dioxide removal really depends on the length of time that a disequilibrium exists between carbon in the ocean and carbon in the atmosphere. So the theory is that the seaweed absorbs the dissolved carbon out of the seawater. That results in depression in CO2 partial pressure in the water. And so the concentration is lower in the water than in the atmosphere, and then that draws down carbon. But that really can be variable over the surface of the ocean. And so we really have to kind of figure out what are the conditions under which that drawdown will occur. So I'm going to turn now to this hypothesis that maybe we can do something else with the seaweed carbon that would result in climate mitigation. And there are many different products that might result in climate mitigation, but I've broken them into three categories. One of them are construction materials. So these are products that can store carbon on sort of a decadal timescale. We're not sure whether that's enough time to appreciably affect the atmospheric lifetime of carbon dioxide and therefore the global warming potential. But there's some indication that these products may have that effect. You can turn seaweed into sort of a simple adobe by mixing it with other plant fibers and mud. You can also turn it into longer lasting fiber boards using more sophisticated processing techniques, and you can turn it into concrete and mortar too as a binding agent. So these are a product category that may contribute to climate mitigation by storing the carbon absorbed by the seaweed instead of sinking it. Another product category are things that replace highly carbon intensive products. And to the extent that people substitute these products for the carbon intensive products, you could get a sparing effect. In other words, we could reduce or avoid a certain amount of carbon dioxide emission into the atmosphere as a result of that substitution. And these include things like biofuels. So you can create a liquid biofuel from seaweed through fermentation. You can also create a biogas that kind of works kind of like natural gas, really through an anaerobic digestion process. These technologies are quite mature, but the economics do not favor them because the costs associated with making them are too high, relative to fossil fuels at the moment. There's another intriguing product called seaweed bioplastic. It turns out that if you process seaweeds fairly lightly, you can extract a lot of the polysaccharides and then use that to make a resin that is suitable for making all kinds of plastic products, from biodegradable wraps to longer lasting, compostable forks and spoons and plates and things like that. So these products are not going to store the carbon, but again, because they're replacing fairly carbon-intensive plastics, the extent to which consumers swap out their, petroleum-based plastics for these seaweed bioplastics could result in a carbon dioxide sparing effect, and also, of course, would reduce microplastic pollution in the ocean because they fall apart, they decompose. And there's another class of seaweed compounds. Again, if you lightly extract the seaweeds, a lot of the phytoactive compounds come off in that extraction, and they seem to enhance crop yield and quality, as well as soil moisture retention, quite a lot, up to 30 or 40% in some cases. And so again, if farmers see this increase in yield by using a seaweed biostimulant, they might be incentivized to reduce their fertilizer use, particularly now that fertilizer prices are fairly high. And the extent to which they do that, reduce their fertilizer use, that could result in a sparing of the greenhouse gases associated with manufacturing that commercial fertilizer. It also might spare the result of another powerful greenhouse gas, nitrous oxide, which is resulting from the excessive use of commercial fertilizer. And then finally, there's some seaweed species that contain a compound called bromoform in high concentration. And this compound seems to be very active in suppressing methane emissions from cows and other ruminants. And there's a little bit of evidence that this same compound and these same seaweeds can suppress methane emissions from manure lagoons, another major source of methane emissions. And of course, if this proves out to be true through longer term trials, and if it proves to be safe for the animals as well as safe for humans who consume the milk and meat from these animals, that could be a high leverage use of seaweed, because methane is a much, much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. It also has a shorter lifespan in the atmosphere. So reducing methane emissions can have a much stronger effect on slowing climate change than reducing, the same number of molecules of carbon dioxide. So as I said, seaweed farming is already profitable. It doesn't require a demonstration that they sequester carbon, and it doesn't require any carbon financing from carbon markets. It is possible to enhance the value of seaweed farming by making other products from the seaweed besides food and colloids, and some of these products might have some climate mitigation potential. It's pretty well documented that seaweeds can remove excessive nutrients, rising from poor land use, like excessive fertilizer application or land clearing, and thereby reducing the risk of eutrophication in some contexts. There's a little bit of evidence that very, very dense seaweed farms can alleviate ocean acidification, at least locally, but we need a lot more studies to kind of prove that out. And there's some evidence that seaweed farms can, serve as biogenic habitat and enhance fisheries in some contexts where natural habitats have been destroyed or damaged. And there's big, big questions around can these seaweed farms actually produce gigaton level carbon removals or other forms of climate mitigation. So to try to answer these questions, the Environmental Defense Fund built this demonstration farm in the central Philippines here. It's a very climate vulnerable spot where the folks have, very few economic alternatives to fishing. And unfortunately, the fishing has been poor because the stocks have been depleted over many decades of overfishing. So we're trying to reform the fisheries there to bring those stocks up, but it's going to take several years for the stocks to recover. And so in the meantime, we're trying to work with local stakeholders and the government to produce alternative forms of livelihood whilst increasing the overall resilience of this whole socio-ecological system. We also want to use this demonstration farm not only to generate livelihoods, but also to fill some of these data gaps that David ran through, and to see if this hypothesis of, using seaweed to produce certain kinds of products can actually yield some net climate mitigation benefits when you tot up all the greenhouse gas emissions as well as the greenhouse savings. So this is a little farm. It's only about 20 meters by 20 meters for demonstration purposes only. But we are seeing very rapid growth of this red seaweed that's commonly farmed throughout the tropics, Capophycus alvarezi. It's growing at about 10% per day. So, after about a month, we have about a ton of seaweed from this tiny little farm. So production is high. We have noticed that we get some degradation after that. And so one of the goals of this farm is to monitor that degradation rate and the sequestration rate and all the greenhouse gas emissions associated with making the farm and running the farm, so we can see if it provides a net carbon sequestration benefit. We're also measuring all these environmental parameters to see if there's an ocean acidification alleviation effect, whether it's removing nutrients, whether it's producing enhanced biodiversity. And we are zeroing in on a field trial of a biostimulant, which we think is one of the more promising climate mitigation benefit seaweed products that we can make, to see if we can generate data to do a life cycle assessment, again, to try to evaluate whether there's a net climate mitigation effect. And we're trying to build this business model with our cost and profit data to see if this is a scalable model. The next steps include things that have nothing to do with climate mitigation. Really, if we're going to scale seaweed farming, there's some fundamental issues that need to be addressed, like disease, the lack of selective breeding, and for climate resilience and so forth. We got to diversify the processing capacity. A lot of it's located in China, and that's created a value chain bottleneck and a depression in prices. So that's got to be overcome through diversification. We really ought to build markets for nutrient removal and the other services that seaweed farms provide that are well documented, not just carbon removal. We need many more studies to evaluate the net climate mitigation potential for these classes of seaweed products that store carbon or replace carbon-intensive products or suppress greenhouse gas emissions. And we got to identify barriers to scaling the products that have the highest climate mitigation potential, and then attract strategic investments to remove those barriers. And then far down the list, in my view, is evaluating the carbon sequestration and developing a verified carbon unit to drive carbon financing for these farms. And then I hope that Kristen will address this last one, which is the evaluation of where you might be able to farm these seaweeds when you consider constraints like profitability, where are the best places to grow for carbon sequestration, where can you avoid conflicts with other marine uses. So let me stop there and turn it back over to Darcy.
Great. Thank you so much, Rob. That was really informative and also looks like a lot of avenues for future research and implementation. If you have questions for Rob, please put them in the chat box and we will ask them after our final speaker, who is Dr. Kristen Davis. She'll be talking about scaling challenges of using macroalgae for climate mitigation. And Kristen has been a professor at the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at UC Irvine since 2012. She's a physical coastal oceanographer who's interested in studying circulation in the coastal ocean, its natural variability, and influence on marine ecosystems and human-nature interactions. Her recent research is focused on understanding nonlinear internal wave dynamics and the feasibility of large-scale offshore cultivation of macroalgae for the production of biofuels and as a strategy to sequester carbon dioxide. So Kristen, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Darcy. And somehow I'm going to bring those disparate research interests together today. I'd like to continue our discussion about the potential for seaweed to contribute meaningfully to carbon dioxide removal. But I'm going to talk specifically about some of the challenges associated with scaling. And I mean this in two senses. Obviously, we've talked about how if we're able to satisfactorily answer some of the fundamental questions that we still have about seaweed as an mCDR strategy, some of the ones that Dave mentioned, Rod mentioned as well, right? What are the most effective carbon pathways for sequestration, and what are the environmental feedbacks of large-scale seaweed farming? If we can answer those, then we need to be able to scale up production of seaweed by expanding farming rapidly. And practically, that means moving into offshore environments, which are fairly novel, for at least some species of seaweed to grow. And so this presents a challenge, right, that we're going to need to address in the future. The other sense in which I mean a challenge, scaling challenges, is that in order to understand where we should be growing seaweeds in the global oceans, how carbon flows through those systems, what the downstream effects are, we need to employ models because the ocean is a dynamic place and it's really expensive and hard to measure, take measurements that are representative. So we need to lean on models in addition to those observations. And in order to capture all the relevant processes in models, we need to understand carbon fluxes in the near field at a farm scale, as well as understand what the carbon fluxes and the implications for that those fluxes are downstream, and so in the far field. So this challenge of scales and representing of some perturbation in the ocean that is propagating away is not unique to seaweed farming. Other marine carbon dioxide removal strategies have the same need to develop models that can cross these scales and help us to understand those downstream effects. So I'm going to address primarily the last thing today and talk about some strategies that we're using to cross those scales. So I was asked to kind of put the bottom line up front. So can Kelp help? I think the answer is that we are still trying to figure out if the answer is yes. I think theoretically, it is possible to produce climate relevant scales of seaweed carbon. That means greater than a gigaton per year in the global oceans, and even in the exclusive economic zones. So not necessarily in the middle of ocean basins, but within exclusive economic zones. So within some distance, smaller distance to shore. But in many areas, it is cost prohibitive. And also it would take up a huge amount of area. We'll talk about exactly how much later, or our estimate of how much later. There also, as Rod mentioned, may be other uses for cultivated seaweed biomass that make more economic sense. In replacing liquid biofuels, for example, for transportation, which is a notoriously hard to decarbonize energy sector. But we don't have to use seaweed biomass for just one thing. There may be parts of the ocean in which it makes sense to sink that biomass if you're over a particularly deep and slow circulation at depth location, or if you're right next to a port, maybe it makes sense to harvest that biomass and make one of these products that Rod was speaking about. We clearly need more research to understand the implications for ocean ecosystems for growing large amounts of seaweed biomass. And in order to answer, to kind of gain that understanding, we need more pilot scale studies like the one that Dave is doing, sinking seaweed, and the one that Rod is doing with a pilot farm to really understand and measure those carbon pathways. We can only model what we can understand. And so we need those ocean observations to inform our models and to help us to then use those models to get the bigger picture. Okay, so In my group, we've been working on the development of a modeling system called MacMods. This incorporates hydrodynamic and biogeochemical ocean dynamics, and it also incorporates a dynamic macroalgae growth model to address a range of questions that are in these little bubbles here. And I'm going to talk about a couple of these questions, or the demands on, the things we need to understand about macroalgae farming range from small scale processes, like we want to be able to use this model. We were first funded by the Department of Energy, ARPA-E, as well, to help design farms for cultivation offshore. So in order to be able to inform farm design, we need to be able to resolve flow through farms and macroalgae growth at farm scales. So we're talking spatial scales of a meter to the size of a typical farm unit, which would be about 1 kilometer, and time scales from those that are relevant for the currents in farms and turbulent fluxes of nutrients or carbon species into and out of the farm. So we're talking about timescales from seconds to growth season timescales, or year. Potentially, you might be also interested in interannual variability, so multiple years. And so those are very different timescales and spatial scales, for example, than a model that we would want to use to assess potential for carbon dioxide removal from a farm, where we really need to be able to track that perturbation over a shelf or even an ocean basin. And so now we're talking about spatial scales from the farm, so like 1 kilometer, to the spatial scales of ocean basins, thousands of kilometers, and time scales from the growing season to the time scales for ocean circulation to turnover. So much longer. And so it's really challenging to, build tools that can kind of span these really important scales to help us understand what we need. So we can't do this all with one model. And again, I think it's really important to emphasize that we can't do it just with models. We really need good observation. We need a lot of observational data to help build these models, and especially in these novel environments. If we're going to move offshore and cultivate seaweed, we need to understand how seaweed grows out there, and what does disease look like, what does predation look like in these novel environments. To that end, we're lucky enough to be working with several seaweed farming projects with Ocean Era in Hawaii, with Loretta Robertson at the Marine Biological Labs, and with Ocean Rainforest. They have a pilot farm that we were out at last week, actually, off of Santa Barbara, and they are growing Macrocystis pyrifera. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. This is a simulation, actually, of flow through Ocean Rainforest's Macrocystis farm. Flow in this model simulation, so we're sort of looking down on the farm, and this Macrocystis is grown in long lines that are about 10 meters depth. And this is flow kind of along the long lines. These blue colors indicate that the flow is sort of slowing down due to drag along these long lines, and it's accelerating in between. And this is a large eddy simulation model that was run by a postdoc, Yan Chow, who's been working with Marcelo Chimecki and Jim McWilliams at UCLA. And one of the really interesting things that they found from this model is that if you space your lines just right, you can get these counter-rotating eddies, these essentially pairs of eddies which tend to upwell water from beneath the farm into the farm, kind of passively upwelling deeper, more nutrient-rich water into the farm. So this is one of the ways in which we're using modeling to help design farms that could potentially get the nutrients they need in offshore environments. But this is a model result, and we need to understand if this actually happens in real farm environments. So we've been working closely with Ocean Rainforest to collect field observations at their farm. These are some pictures from our work last year, actually. These are some collaborators at UCLA and UCSD. We are putting instruments on a wave profiling platform here called a wire walker, measuring currents, water column structure, chlorophyll, fluorescence. Also, this year at the farm, we're doing a lot of measuring of carbon species and nutrients within the farm as well. This is a profiler, acoustic Doppler current profiler. Here we're measuring turbulent mixing in the farm, trying to see if we see some evidence of these attached eddies that are upwelling water and shear-induced mixing at the base of the farm. And here's actually just hot off the presses. I just downloaded this. This is data from yesterday out at the farm, 5 kilometers off of Santa Barbara. And one of the reasons that we really need observations to really understand what this environment looks like. Because if we look at just an average density profile, even in the Santa Barbara Channel or anywhere in the ocean, we get one picture. But if we look at the time variable environment in which these kelp in this case are really growing, we can see that it's very different case. This cooler water, this kind of purplish water down here is the stuff with all the nutrients, this yellow water up here, this is depth and time, this is around 24 hours. This warmer water up here has much less nutrients. The long lines are at about 10 meters. So you can see there's a very episodic delivery of this cold water with the nutrients into the farm, accompanied by this is the steepened front of an internal tide, driving some pretty exciting internal wave activities. I told you I'd try it all together. And these internal waves are drawing that deep water up into the canopy and feeding the kelp out there. So that's really exciting. Okay, so we're using this model to help farmers to think about consequences of different operational decisions like seed out date, cultivation depth, and harvesting strategies. So these are the kinds of practical things that we're able to help farmers with, and that end up being really important. As Rod said, there's a lot of practical things we have to learn about growing seaweed before we can get to sequestering a lot of carbon with them. We have to be able to grow it first. Sort of expanding our scale a little in our modeling, we are beginning to also use the model to think about farm environment feedbacks, right? And so in order to do that, we need to think about the environment in which this farm is placed. Again, we're looking at sort of a simulated farm off of Santa Barbara. And this is a sort of a simulated wake downstream of this farm and the footprint of this farm over several days. And this is a challenging model to put together. This in particular has been led by Dr. Daniel Dalhare and Dr. Christina Frieder in putting fully coupling the hydrodynamic, the biogeochemical, and the seaweed growth model in order to get at these questions. The largest scale, of course, is thinking about the potential for seaweed as a strategy for carbon sequestration. This is kind of a simple schematic of this, and you've seen more of those in this talk, so I won't belabor it. Essentially, we were funded by the Climate Works Foundation to use our model to think about this potential for essentially growing enough biomass. Could we grow enough biomass to make a climate relevant dent in carbon sequestration? So the first step in evaluating that potential is estimating how much seaweed we can grow. And this modeling exercise was led by Dr. Isabella Arzeno-Soltero. She is now faculty at UCLA. She was a postdoc on this project at the time. So she was running our dynamic macroalgae growth model with all of these various rates of growth and environmental limitations. And it turns out that you can grow a lot of seaweed, theoretically, in the oceans. But the answer to the question of how much you can grow is very dependent on what your assumptions about the available nutrients are. and how much seaweed would be competing with phytoplankton in the ocean. And so in this estimate, we, in our most conservative estimate, where we limit the uptake of nutrients to what would be available to new nutrients upwelled into the upper ocean, we find that we can grow a lot of seaweed, particularly in the equatorial Pacific, and that the types of seaweed that grow well are tropical reds and temperate browns make the biggest dent in globally. And that it is theoretically possible to harvest more than a gigaton of seaweed of carbon per year in global exclusive economic zones. This is not sequestered carbon, note, this is just carbon in seaweed. In this model run, we were not actually tracking the fate of it at depth as Dave is doing in his project right now. But farming this much seaweed would require over 1 million square kilometers of the most productive exclusive economic zones globally. And there is there are diminishing returns that if you farm, after you farm the most productive areas of the ocean that are replete with nutrients and get plenty of light, it starts to take a much bigger area to get the next gigaton of seaweed carbon. So the next question, and I know I'm a little over time, so I'll accelerate here, is you have to estimate how much it costs to grow seaweed everywhere in the ocean. And of course, we have to incorporate our understanding of things about the capital costs of building those farms, transportation and labor to take that product to port or to sink it in place. And then that we also want to understand what the market value of any products that are made from seaweed are. We have to think about, if we sink it, what fraction of that is sequestered. And as Rod mentioned, that it's not necessarily a 1-for-1. If we, fix a gram of carbon in the upper ocean, we're not necessarily pulling, that same amount out of the atmosphere. There's an efficiency there. So it turns out, under our most optimistic assumptions, that sinking seaweed, farmed seaweed to the deep sea, that would be past the 100-year time horizon, could cost as little as $540 per ton of CO2, but that using farmed seaweed products, farmed seaweed for products that may avoid a gigaton of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas emissions could potentially return a profit. For example, for for food, we could potentially get $20 per ton of CO2 equivalent. So essentially, that as Rod mentioned, this is another way to deliver climate benefits from seaweed by displacing greenhouse gas emissions using seaweed products. Another thing I'd like to let you know is out there. The Department of Energy released their 2023 billion ton report that really looks at the potential for biofuel feedstocks, and this is the first year that they've included macroalgae as a chapter in that report. And so this is an image from that chapter where we're using the BACMODS model to estimate this biomass in US waters. Turns out Alaska and Maine, great places to grow seaweed, but we already knew that because there's lots of seaweed farms starting up there. And if you're interested to play around with some of the model results, I would point you to a website that was put together by Carbon Plan that summarizes our paper results and also has a nice interactive model that you can change. You can play with some of the assumptions that we made in the papers that we've published from it. So I won't repeat myself about Kelp Help. I think I've done that already, and I'll just conclude there. Thanks.
Great. Thank you for your presentation, Kristen. It's really neat to see these model results and also some of the work that's being done on farms right now experimentally. It seems clear that there's still a lot of questions to be answered in this realm. I'd like to thank all of our speakers today. Those were very informative presentations, and we're going to start with Q&A in just a second. I'll be turning it over to Lauren Linsmeyer to moderate the Q&A, but first we're going to do 2 quick poll questions. Oh, great, the poll's up there right now. We're hoping to get your general sense of macroalgae as a strategy for marine carbon dioxide removal. All right. Let's check out the results there. Okay. Again, a spread with about half the group feeling somewhere in between skeptical and hopeful. And then our last poll question today is, what do you think is the best use of cultivated macroalgae? All right. And we'll look at the answers there. Okay. Again, a spectrum, but most people leaning towards biostimulants and fertilizers, followed by additives. All right. And then I have one announcement before the Q&A. That's that the Department of Energy's Pacific Northwest National Laboratory is going to be hosting a virtual workshop and listening session on mCDR for the Pacific Northwest region in June. So the geographic focus here is Oregon, Washington, and Alaska. And their goal is to try to understand Pacific Northwest community, tribal, and other public information needs around mCDR and marine energy. And we're going to put a link in the chat with more information and to register for those listening sessions. And now I'll turn it over to Lauren, who's going to moderate our Q&A today.
Great, thanks, Darcy. And thanks so much again to our speakers. I invite them to turn on their cameras as well for the Q&A. We have just over 15 minutes for this part, which is great. It was really interesting hearing about all of the amazing research happening on the modeling and some of these pilot projects and all of the questions that still remain. We've had a lot of questions coming in and might not be able to get to all of them, but wanted to start with a question around MRV, or monitoring, reporting, and verification. So David or Kristen, what is needed to develop reliable MRV for seaweed, CDR? And how does or can MRV include these potential ecological or environmental impacts? And I also wanted to add in the audience question around specifically getting at how can we get the equilibrium CO2 balance measured for MRV sped up, which is quite hard for small startups to do. So would either of you like to start tackling the MRV question?
Why don't I just start about the disequilibrium part of this? If you're considering doing the MRV for doing carbon accounting, and you want to know how much is the action that you're doing, your CDR action, will affect the atmosphere. I mean, the disequilibrium problem, as Rod said, I said, you know, is a major roadblock, and it's a roadblock for any of the marine CDR approaches. So it's not particular. There are for seaweed, if you grow it, you fortunately know how much you've grown. You would know what its carbon content is. If you're monitoring your farm, you may know how much of the DOM is released, and you might know something about its durability, so to speak. I can't imagine it having multi-decadal durability, but so you know, so that part of it's straightforward. It's been interesting watching the community change, the CDR world kind of change what it considers part of MRV or not. Early on, it was only about carbon and doing carbon accounting for monetizing. Now it seems that kind of keeping track of ecological impacts is now part of it. All of this stuff's a moving target, but anyways, you guys can fill in, I'll shut up.
I would just add quickly, I know Kristen has something to say on this too, but it's straightforward to measure all the carbon reservoirs and fluxes, kind of, but at our farm, it's way too costly and way too labor intensive for any sane seaweed farmer to undertake that if they're looking for carbon financing. So one of the goals of our project is to understand the variability around these carbon pools and fluxes, and then try to create a de minimis monitoring plan that is more cost effective and doesn't require the farmer to be out there every single week to take all these measurements. And we hope that will help ease that part of the MRV problem. That includes carbon, but also biodiversity effects, habitat impacts, nutrient removal, pH, and all those things.
I would say that MRV is, I haven't thought about this a lot for terrestrial systems, but it's a particular challenge in the ocean, especially when you're thinking about fluxes of carbon, because the ocean is always has been a highly variable environment, and you're trying to measure the fluxes of a small signal in a highly variable environment, which means taking time series of things. And so right now, we're really trying still to figure out what are the best metrics for MRV, ways to measure that or to estimate that carbon flux. I think modeling is going to play a big role, more than it does for terrestrial systems. We have to be able to rely on models. And so really we're going to have to think about what are the observations that we have to collect in order to make sure that our models are getting it about right and to kind of maybe to initialize our models, or to give our models the boundary conditions that they need. So it's a special challenge for the oceans to measure these fluxes. And while we may understand, even if we understand those pools of carbon, and we're not there yet all the way for seaweed, as I am so eager to get the results from Dave's DOC work and Craig Carlson and Chance English, and because that work is exactly what we need to plug into our models to help figure out what are those carbon pools and where are they going. So where was I going with this? So we really need observations to inform models, and then the models will end up of a given perturbation of a given farm in a given location may be the way that we account for that carbon sequestered.
Great, thank you all so much. Moving a bit to the seaweed products. So Rod and Kristen both talked about seaweed-derived alternatives to more polluting petroleum-based materials that may, in fact, have more of a net climate benefit than sinking in some cases. But what barriers do exist to bringing these products to market? And also, would it be feasible, as someone, I believe in the chat, asked, to extract some of the valuable compounds from the biomass before sinking it?
Well, I'll start with the classic scientific answer. It depends. The different seaweed product classes are at various levels of techno-economic maturity, as Kristen can attest. Our assessment concludes that biostimulants and biofuels are there, they're commercializable. Biostimulants actually are a commercial product that you can buy on the market today, and there's strong demand. And so that's one of the reasons why we're testing biostimulants, because we don't have to create a new market for that particular product. The construction materials that store carbon are at a much more primitive state of development. There's a lot of technical problems around durability in making these products, And I would say the bioplastics is kind of intermediate. There are a couple of firms that are starting to make large sales of bioplastic resin made from seaweed. So it's kind of starting to move from the pilot phase into the commercial phase. And the products that suppress methane are, they have very strong experimental effects on methane suppression, but we really need some of these longer term field trials with actual cows. A lot of those experiments were done in vitro, some were done with actual cows. Now we need these longer term trials to see if the bromine kind of accumulates in the milk or meat or affects the animals in some way. So yeah, it's all over the place. And how to remove the barriers, I think one is to try to do the research to understand which of these has the most potential, given the uncertainty around substitution, first of all, and also how many greenhouse gases are emitted during the manufacturing and transport of the seaweed and the products. That's going to have a large effect on whether it has a net climate mitigation effect or not.
Great, thank you. And did either of you want to answer the question about potentially extracting the compounds before sinking it? Or whether we can do something with the biomass before it goes to the deep ocean?
I mean, I'd say that people are definitely considering that. One of the some of the projects being funded by the Department of Energy right now are trying to think about rare earth elements that are bioaccumulated by seaweeds being extracted from the biomass before then the biomass could be used for other things. And so that would be a high value use for that. That these elements exist in seawater, but getting them accumulated in any concentration to be valuable is difficult. There's some evidence that potentially seaweeds bioaccumulate those. And so, but there's many things that I think could be, I'm not an expert in industrial processes, but I imagine that, yeah, you could imagine doing something with seaweed before you then sink the biomass. But
yeah, exactly. And actually, I'm not an expert either, but we have been talking to a lot of engineers and entrepreneurs, and some of them are excited about this process called cascading biorefining. So this is an industrial process in which you sequentially extract materials. Different fractions come off with different extractions. And it turns out that a lot of the really valuable stuff in seaweeds come off in the first or second extractions. And so that leaves a lot of the polysaccharides and fibers in the residue. So it's at least theoretically possible to get some of those nutraceuticals and bioactive compounds and biostimulants out first, and then dump the carbon residue to sequester that carbon.
The only thing I'd like to add is that doing anything in the ocean for a long period of time is really, really, really hard. You know, and we have put out, we have long-term moorings that have been out for decades. And it is, it's, like at Station P, like in, like in places like that in the middle of the Pacific. And it takes an awful lot of effort to do this. And to do that at huge scales. I don't mean to be the pessimist, but I am.
Gotta bring in some realism too. Thanks, Dave and all. So wanted to talk a little bit about deep sea potential impacts. If any of you are able to comment on what we know there about some of the potential impacts of sinking seaweed to deep sea habitats, and how can we measure and monitor those potential impacts, and how might we mitigate them?
I mean, the things that we know, there's been a series of studies where people take logs and they weight them and they put them on the sea floor. They come back 6 months, a year later. They've done it with bales of kelp and then that they put on the sea floor. And to do those experiments, you need, here I go again. You need things like Alvin. You need to have deep teams of people to do these experiments. and to understand how to do, how to do the mechanics of seeing this. So what's going to happen, the thing that I'm worried about is if you put seaweed on the seafloor and then you put more on top of it, you've gone through and you've made it something anoxic, which means that sulfur becomes your next donor of electrons, and that, what will happen as you're doing that? I mean, obviously there are places, of course, that happens naturally in the bottom of the Santa Barbara Basin, for example, but there's places that it doesn't. And so if, we really don't know. That's the really hard one. And it's, to do those sorts of experiments is millions and millions of dollars. I mean, it's not easy. And I don't want to do them.
Great, thank you. I know we're starting to get close on time and we have a lot of other questions to get to, but I wanted to maybe have us switch to pilot projects, because all of you mentioned the importance of pilot projects and have been involved in various pilot projects in the US or around the world. What are some of the top questions that you each hope these pilot projects can seek to answer about seaweed, CDR, and who should be involved in these pilot projects?
Well, I can certainly say that the projects underway are the things I'm most excited to learn from them are, as I mentioned, kind of evidence of the most promising carbon pathways, like the DOC results that I was mentioning for some of Dave's work, and the fate of that deep biomass. How long does it take to remineralize? And this is maybe speaking to a little bit of Meg Chadzy's question in the Q&A, is if we do that kind of sinking experiment in different benthic environments, how does the answer to that question change? So as far as who needs to be involved, it is a diverse group of scientists, because different people specialize in different things. I tend to think about fairly shallow areas, shelf environments, but that's going to be someone different who thinks about abyssal environments and has the expertise to think about the relevant biogeochemistry there. Obviously, we need phycologists. We need people who understand seaweed, and people who understand circulation, and people who can communicate that. So it really does need to be a large team effort.
That's a great answer. And I would only add that, that's on the knowledge production end, who needs to be involved. There's also going to be people affected, by the seaweed farm and the ecosystem services either produces or reduces. So in the Philippines, it's been really important to get the mayor involved, because the mayor has jurisdiction over municipal waters. It's been really important to get the local community involved, because this is, after all, intended in part to be an alternative livelihood for fishermen. So we need to make sure that the fishermen were interested, and they are. And so that local involvement has resulted not only in better farm design using local expertise, but also siting, because we didn't have enough data to do a really rigorous siting analysis, but the fishermen helped us to find a site where our farm wouldn't immediately get destroyed by storms. And it's socializing the idea of seaweed farming in this region of the Philippines where it's relatively new, and generating some interest among the local political leaders, and providing subsidies and kind of scaling this up.
Great, thank you all. And I think we will have to end it there with the formal questions. I wanted to see if any of the speakers had any final words or remarks they wanted to make briefly before we have to close here. Anything that you weren't able to cover? I think we had a pretty comprehensive discussion, but I see Dave go off mute.
Yeah, no, I just have just one thought. I mean, with the scale, with the at scale question, I mean, doing this at scale, we don't have a workforce of folks to do that sort of thing. And, you know, thinking, being now an educator, you know, in some sense, those of us who've been doing ocean sciences for a while have to be thinking about maybe being trained more like engineers and that sort of thing. And, you know, so I think this workforce question is really an important one that, you know, all of the CDR strategies are going to get impacted by.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that someone asked made a really astute comment that, you know, carbon financing would really help, right? I didn't mean to dismiss that idea. It's just that the point I was trying to make is that if you think about all the possible ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere, seaweed farming could be the one that's profitable now without the need to develop a carbon financing stream. But that's not to say if we can do that, if we can demonstrate carbon removal in a robust way, robust enough to attract carbon financing on a high integrity carbon market, so much the better.
Great. Well, with that, we'd like to again thank the three speakers so much for your very fascinating talks and time. And thank you all so much for attending this webinar today. A quick reminder that in the chat, we've put some information on an mCDR Pacific Northwest listening session in June. And we welcome any feedback or other questions or suggestions for this webinar series. And a recording will be available on the CCAN, Alaska, OA Network, and OST websites. And stay tuned for the next announcement on our next webinar. Thank you all so much and hope you have a great rest of the day.